A sharp smell of vinegar, hot metal, and blood. This was the scent of a Roman legion's life after battle. Amidst the noise and groans of the wounded, to the sound of stretcher-bearers' footsteps, one of the soldiers cried out, not from pain, but from horror. "He's still alive!" And at that moment, a man in a white chiton was already approaching him, not with a shield, but with a knife and a sponge. This was not an executioner, but one who was meant to save. But how to save if the medicine is red-hot iron? How could one survive when treatment begins with the smoke and hiss of a heated blade? And what made these people capable, not just of enduring, but of believing that pain saves? The answer to this is hidden in the heart of Roman discipline, where medicine was an extension of war. According to the testimony of the Roman historian Celsus, legion doctors did not fear blood. They acted quickly, almost mechanically, washing the wound with vinegar, covering it with a powder of herbs, and then cauterizing with iron to stop the blood and kill the evil breath, which is what they called infection. This was not a cruel ritual, but the science of its time. Things that today we would call antiseptics were then weapons against death itself. Doctors in the army were called medics, but not all of them were scholars. Most came from the ranks of soldiers. A medic was not just a treating physician. They were a warrior accustomed to pain who knew that seconds decided everything. If a wound was not cauterized, the person would die of fever. If it was cauterized, they would live, but would forever remember the smell of burnt skin. Imagine iron, white-hot, a scream, a flash of pain, and silence. In this moment, life and death merged, discipline and fear. For the Romans, this was an act of purification, almost sacred. Their bodies had to be whole, their spirit unyielding. Even after being wounded, a legionary was obliged to return to the ranks. Archaeologists found remnants of medical instruments, scalpels, forceps, needles, and even metal probes in a military camp near Vindobona, modern-day Vienna. These findings confirmed that Roman doctors had an entire arsenal, a miniature forge of life. Each item was sharpened like a weapon, and in their hands, steel served not for killing, but for healing. But behind all this precision lay another question. Who treated the medics themselves when the war did not end? For beneath the doctor's cloak lay the same fatigue, the same fear of another scream, the same hiss of iron against flesh. Thus began the history of the Roman hospital, in a place where war met science and man met his own endurance. It was here, amidst the wards and the smell of vinegar, that Roman medicine achieved what many empires could not. It transformed pain into a tool for survival. And in the next moment, we will see how this healing machine worked from within, how the legion was able to heal itself like a living body, where every wound had its own ritual. As the sun rose over the camp, the Roman hospital, the Valetudinarium, was already living its own unique life. Its silence was not peace. Here one could hear muffled groans, the clinking of instruments, the rustle of fabric, and the smell of vinegar ingrained in the stones. The Valetudinarium, as the military hospital was called, a place where war continued without swords. This was no makeshift tent. Each building had a strict structure, designed with the same Roman meticulousness as their fortifications. Stone walls, extended rows of cots, channels for draining water and blood. Everything was subject to the logic of order, because even pain had to be organized. Archaeologists found such hospitals in Carnuntum, in Britain, and near Lugdunum. Their layout was almost identical, a long corridor, on both sides of which were rooms, each with 6 cots. The central part was an operating room, where bronze vessels with vinegar and sponges made of seagrass stood. These sponges were not just rags. They absorbed the antiseptic solution with which wounds were washed. Vinegar acted as a sterilizer, killing putrefaction, long before humanity learned about microbes. Doctors of various ranks worked here. Above all stood the archiator, the chief medic of the legion, almost a military officer. Below them were the capsarii, assistants who transported the wounded and bandaged them. They carried leather pouches at their belts with bandages, sponges, and powder made from copper ore, another ancient antiseptic. For them, death was part of the routine, like a change of guard. When one died, they simply turned the body aside to make room for the next. The treatment process itself looked like a ritual. Soldiers were brought in on stretchers, theretra, wooden frames with stretched straps. He was laid on a stone table, held down by straps, and what the legionaries themselves called a test of courage began. The doctor examined the wound. If the bone was shattered, amputation. If the cut was deep, cauterization. Red-hot iron hooks, copper forceps, and ointments based on resin and wine were used. Wine served as an anesthetic, but more often, it only softened the scream. Celsus wrote that, "A true doctor must not be soft or indecisive, but confident in his stroke, like an executioner." This cold principle determined everything. A patient's life depended not on pity, but on the precision of the hand. Every cut, every stitch was a step between life and death. Among the Romans' instruments was a special item, a bronze catheter, a thin tube used for bladder injuries. There is evidence that even skull operations, trepanations, were performed in military hospitals, and some patients survived. On skulls found in Nimes and British Gaul, traces of healing are visible. This means that these operations were not random experiments. Behind them was a system passed down from legion to legion. Doctors in Rome often came from Greek provinces, where the traditions of Hippocrates intertwined with battlefield practice. They wrote treatises, but their true wisdom was born not in libraries, but in the smell of blood and vinegar. For them, medicine was an extension of discipline. The one who healed had to be as resilient as the one who fought. But there were other unseen heroes of this system, sanitary officers responsible for the camp's cleanliness. In a Roman camp, every ditch, every pit had its place. Water flowed strictly in one direction, so as not to return to the tents. Even waste was removed on schedule. This seemed minor, but it was sanitary discipline that saved more lives than red-hot iron. Modern historians, such as Goldsworthy, believe that the Roman army triumphed not only with the sword, but also with cleanliness. Just imagine, every spoonful of vinegar, every sponge, every drop of boiling resin, the result of centuries of experience. But this order rested on one law. A soldier's body belonged to the empire. He was treated not out of mercy, but out of calculation. The legionary was expected to return to the ranks, and the less time he spent in the hospital, the better for the army. In this lay the essence of the Roman approach to medicine, to heal so as to throw back into battle. And the better the valetudinarium functioned, the longer the empire itself could live. For every healed legionary was a brick in its walls. But what happened when these walls became too numerous? When blood ceased to stop even with red-hot iron, and discipline cracked under the weight of fear? When did doctors first realize that the empire was starting to sicken, just like its soldiers? Battle is not only a clash of swords, but also a test for medicine. When the legion entered battle, a medic always walked beside the tribune, a leather bag with sponges, forceps, and vinegar hanging over his shoulder. His place was not in the ranks, but behind the sentries, right at the field of death. It was there where dust mingled with blood that true Roman surgery was born. When lines broke, when the horn sounded for retreat, the work began for those who wore no helmets, yet saved more lives than any commander. The historian Vegetius wrote that the Romans do not abandon their wounded, for every soldier is a part of the army, and the army is a single body. Thus operated the law of the empire. To lose one was to weaken all. After battle, soldiers carried their comrades' bodies to the tents. The dead were laid on the right, the living on the left. The sworded ones were then treated with sponges soaked in vinegar, and the dying were given water, if any remained. This was not pity, it was a system. Among the medics, there was an unwritten rule. Those who can return to the ranks are treated first, a harsh but necessary condition. Capsarii, the junior medics, determined this with a glance. If a soldier breathed steadily, If a bone was not shattered, he was taken. If their eyes glazed over, they moved on. The goal was not to save everyone, but to preserve the army. Sometimes battle turned into a disaster, and the hospital couldn't cope. Then doctors had to improvise. Historians mention a case during the siege of Jerusalem, when legionaries, lacking iron instruments, cauterized wounds with embers. This was a desperate yet effective step. The vinegar they used to wash the skin hissed on the burns. The smell was unbearable. But it was this mixture of pain and acid that stopped putrefaction. One of the most terrifying instruments was called a ferra. It was an iron rod that was heated in embers and then pressed against a bleeding spot. The hiss was a sign of life. If the sound ceased, it meant the blood had clotted and the soldier would survive. For the legionaries, this was the sound of salvation. Almost every field procedure was done without anesthesia. Wine, of course, was given, but more often it merely helped them lose consciousness. Those who survived recounted hearing their own skin, as if it sang beneath the iron. Some lost consciousness, and this is precisely what saved them from the pain. The term the Romans applied to such procedures was cauterium, cauterization. In it, horror and salvation converged. Cauterium did not merely stop the blood. It cleansed the body of the evil spirit of disease. For a Roman, illness was an enemy. It had to be defeated just like a barbarian. When the battlefield was cleared, bodies were removed, but the medics' work did not end. The hospital filled quickly, and here began the true marvel of Roman logistics. Each hospital maintained a roster of the wounded. Scribes recorded who was from which cohort, what had been done to him, and when he could return to the ranks. This order astounds even modern military historians. An army capable of keeping records amidst the chaos of blood and death was a machine where a human became a component, but a necessary component. Archaeological excavations in Germanic camps showed that many bones found in medical zones bear traces of knee amputations, and even attempts at prosthetics. Simple wooden or bronze prostheses, crude but functional. This meant that a legionary who lost an arm was still considered a part of the empire. He could train recruits, perform logistical tasks, guard warehouses. Even after the loss, the body remained useful. Doctors of that time did not know the word rehabilitation, but understood that a person who survived had to be occupied. Inactivity for a Roman was the worst disease. Therefore, convalescents were sent to work in the camp, cleaning weapons, digging ditches. Pain was dulled by labor. Tacitus wrote that a Roman despises bodily weakness, for his spirit must be stronger than pain. This was not just a phrase, it was the credo of a civilization where suffering was considered part of service. A legionary who had passed through red-hot iron returned changed, not just a survivor, but hardened in the literal sense of the word. But this system had a shadow. Sometimes red-hot iron saved the body, but broke the mind. There were those who could no longer hold a sword, who feared fire, who retreated into the silence of the wards. No one wrote about them. They were not recorded in reports. The empire treated the flesh, but not the soul. And yet, even in this cruelty, a strange humanity was felt. Because every time a doctor raised the red-hot iron, he fought not only for the soldier, he fought for Rome. But what happened when the empire itself began to need treatment, when its wounds began to fester from within, and red-hot iron no longer helped even it? By the mid-2nd century CE, Rome was at the peak of its power, but beneath its marble skin, decay was already beginning. The empire, accustomed to treating soldiers with red-hot iron, itself needed cauterization. Along the roads where legions once marched, now moved the sick and refugees. Epidemics, later to be called the Antonine Plague, swept across everything, from Damascus to Britain. According to the testimonies of Cassius Dio, bodies rotted directly in the hospitals, and doctors, having no explanation, cauterized wounds in the very same way, with iron, vinegar, and prayer. But the system, once created for war, knew how to adapt. Valetudinaria were transformed into quarantine centers. They were built outside the camps, surrounded by ditches, to prevent the spread of disease. Their entrances were guarded by armed legionaries. Disease had become an enemy against which a guard was also posted. Inside, work was bustling. Sponges were now used not only for washing wounds, but also for purifying the air, burning them after each use. Archaeological findings in Syria confirm sponges and bandages are often found in pits together with charcoal, meaning they were indeed burned in an attempt to stop the contagion. The term that then came into use was contagium, touch, infection. The Romans did not know about microbes, but they sensed that disease was transmitted through contact. Therefore, in hospitals, smoke from juniper and sulfur began to be used, believing that it purified the air. This was the first prototype of sanitary disinfection. Doctors did not understand the essence of the process, but the method worked. The mortality rate among personnel decreased. Not only Romans worked in these hospitals. After Hadrian's reforms, medics often came from the eastern provinces, Syria, Egypt, Greece. They brought their knowledge, ointments of myrrh, rosemary oils, opium infusions. For the wounded, this was almost a miracle. Wine, vinegar, and red-hot iron remained the foundation, but something soft, almost human, was added to them. Warriors accustomed to pain felt care for the first time. But it was during this period that it became clear that Roman medicine could not heal everything. A soldier wounded on a distant frontier could no longer be brought to the hospital in time. The empire's distances grew faster than its roads. Therefore, expeditionary medical units, primitive equivalents of mobile hospitals, began to be created in the legions. Each unit now had its own set of dressing materials, and one or two capsarii. They treated directly on the field, in the rain, under arrows, sometimes in the mud. This was the first step towards what is today called battlefield medicine. According to the descriptions of the historian Galen, who served under Marcus Aurelius, military doctors began to use new instruments, bronze syringes to irrigate pus, thin needles for suturing with linen thread. He wrote that wounds should not just be cauterized, but cleaned until the body breathes freshness. For its time, this was an almost revolutionary approach. For the first time, the concept of cleaning and restoration emerged, and not just stopping blood. Galen also noted that many soldiers' illnesses originated not from the sword, but from fatigue and hunger. A legionary's diet was precise to the ounce: grain, wine, vinegar, salted meat. But in distant campaigns, when supplies broke down, the ration turned into torment. Then disease came not from outside, but from within: scurvy, exhaustion, fever. Doctors wrote that the body became like a weakened fortress wall. To save it, what was needed was not iron and fire, but bread and water. But the empire could no longer feed all its defenders. With each decade, medicine increasingly reflected the state of the nation. Valetudinaria became smaller, resources scarcer, doctors poorer. When borders collapsed, so did order within the wards. Sometimes only the elderly and wounded remained at the hospitals, caring for each other. Chronicles state that former legionaries, who knew the basics of bandaging, taught young slaves to treat burns and dislocations. Thus, ancient military medicine transformed into folk medicine. And yet, even in decline, it retained astonishing vitality, because somewhere deep within this system burned an old Roman idea. Life is a duty to the empire. Though weak, wounded, but still life. Even when red-hot iron lost its power, the doctor's spirit remained iron-like. But it was precisely in this contrast between scorched flesh and a fading spirit that the symbol of an era's end lay hidden. The empire, which once healed its wounds with vinegar and discipline, now groaned itself like a soldier on a stone table. And the more doctors cauterized its sores, the clearer it became. The disease had penetrated deeper than the skin. By the end of the 3rd century CE, warriors returning from the Germanic and Eastern fronts brought with them not only wounds but also experience transformed into a system. Roman medicine, which began as a set of field techniques, now became part of military doctrine. The hospital, valetudinarium, was no longer a temporary refuge. It became a permanent institution, integrated into the legion's infrastructure. Its plans, found in camps near Mainz and Numidia, show how it connected with the forge, kitchen, and temple, as if a soldier's health required not only knives and ointments, but also food and prayer. Every detail had meaning. Next to the wards, there was always a tiled water source to prevent contamination. Blood and washing solutions flowed into separate channels leading to cesspits, and the walls of the hospitals were covered with lime, believing that the white color repelled disease. Even the wind was used deliberately. Buildings were oriented so that air circulated as a draft, an ancient but effective ventilation. Alongside this, the psychology of treatment also changed. If during Celsus's era, a doctor was almost an executioner, now he was becoming a guardian of life. Respect for the healing process itself emerged. On the gravestones of doctors from Lugdunum and Ravenna, one can read inscriptions. He returned many to service, brief but with pride. Medicine ceased to be a craft of pain and became a profession. The term that then became established was chirurgus, one who works with their hands. Not a philosopher, not a magician, but a master of flesh. A chirurgus no longer simply cauterized wounds. He stitched tendons, set bones, extracted arrows. Some operations are described by Galen with such precision that they could be replicated even today. He taught that the body is a mechanism, and the doctor is its technician. For an empire built on order and discipline, this was a perfect metaphor. But this rationality had a downside. The more perfected medicine became, the more ruthlessly it utilized humans. A legionary no longer had the right to die from a wound if he could live. He was pulled from death to return to service, even if his body was broken. Letters from a centurion found in Egypt recount how survivors with severe injuries were assigned to secondary posts: guard duty, crafts, courier service. They were called invalidi, disabled but still useful. It is hard to imagine how much pain these people endured. Some of them lost limbs but remained true to their oath. For them, the hospital was not a place of rest, but a forge where their bodies were reforged. Rome created not just an army, but a mechanism of self-restoration. Even suffering was transformed into a function. Archaeological data confirm that during this period, more tools for reconstruction appeared. Metal plates for bones, wooden splints with bronze clasps. In one of the hospitals in Capua, a set of 6 different prostheses was found, from fingers to an entire leg. This proves that doctors were no longer merely saving lives, but trying to restore the body's lost form. For the ancient world, this was an almost incredible step. Meanwhile, chaos intensified on the empire's borders. With each decade, wars became more frequent and doctors fewer. Young medics could not be trained quickly enough. And yet Rome held on, because its medicine was embedded in the very idea of the army. Even if a legion was defeated, its survivors could treat each other. In the ruins of hospitals, archaeologists found not only instruments, but also inscriptions made by soldiers' hands, iron saves. This simple phrase conveyed the full meaning of their belief, but behind this belief lay weariness. When wars dragged on for years, the wounded returned to the same hospitals. Where the clinking of instruments was once heard, now sounded the cough of old legionaries. Pain ceased to be temporary. It became a way of life. Doctors no longer distinguished whom they were treating, a soldier or a shadow. Nevertheless, it was during these years that something new was born, the germ of what would later be called military psychiatry. Some medics wrote about tremors after battle, about dreams in which the wounded saw the flame of iron. At the time, no one could explain this, but the doctors themselves began to notice that not all wounds were on the body. Some were in the mind. And for the first time in Roman history, rest began to be used as treatment. Patients were sent south to the sea to breathe the air of tranquility. A simple measure, but it saved more than red-hot iron. And yet, everyone who had once undergone cauterization forever carried within them the memory of that sound, the hiss that separated life from death. For these people, the hospital was a temple of pain, but also a place of rebirth. The empire could crumble, cities burn, legions vanish, but where iron glowed, life still flickered. And while the last ember smoldered in Rome, in one of the hospitals, amidst the cries of the wounded and the smell of vinegar, someone again raised iron to the fire. The empire was cracking, but its hands still healed. And this sound, short, hoarse, like a soldier's breath, became a symbol of Rome's last breath. When the Western Empire began to crumble, medicine did not die with it. It dissolved into new worlds. Valetudinaria emptied, but their walls did not disappear. Monks settled in the former hospitals, transforming them into shelters for the sick and pilgrims. The change was almost imperceptible. Where iron was once used for cauterization, now psalms were read. Instead of vinegar, holy water. Instead of a sponge, prayer. But the essence remained the same. To save the body in order to save the soul. Legion veterans who had moved to villages and fortresses carried their knowledge with them. They taught how to treat a wound with wine, how to bandage with toasted linen fabric, how to ensure water cleanliness. These simple techniques survived for centuries. Medieval healers, unaware of their origin, repeated Roman practices almost verbatim. Even the word hospitalis, hospitable, was born from those same hospitals. And yet, something had changed. Medicine, once military, became spiritual. The goal was not to return a person to the ranks, but to allow them to die with prayer. Cauterization with iron became rare. It was replaced by herbs and faith. But archaeologists find traces. In the basements of monasteries, the same instruments as in Roman hospitals are stored, only covered with crosses. Iron did not disappear. It became a symbol of crucifixion. Thus ended the cycle that began with the legion and the red-hot blade. Rome taught humanity to heal not out of mercy, but out of duty. And this duty outlived the empire. Every time a doctor touches a wound, in that movement is the shadow of an ancient surgeon, bending over a soldier under the heat of a torch. The empire died, but its medicine remained in the hands of those who knew. Salvation requires pain. And therefore, as long as the fire burns and breath sounds, Roman science is still alive. In every gesture, in every bandage, in every sound of iron touching flesh.